Hey, welcome to Bible study. This week we're going old school because the bug has hit Taylor, our technical professional here at the church, and so we're unable to simulcast the live Bible study on Thursday. So Bible study has just ended, and I have come here into the studio, and we're going to record a 30-minute version of the Bible study. Basically, what you're going to get is going to get my part. You're not going to be able to hear the discussion of anybody else. So this is just like it was before we had Taylor on staff and we could put together the Bible study. But it's better than nothing. So we figured you would want to be able to keep up with our study of Romans. As you can see, we're looking at Romans chapter 7, verses 7 through 12. And we're going to jump into these verses. But before we do that, we've got to be reminded of where we have been and what we were talking about. And the big thing that we were talking about last week that came up in our conversation is the connection between the law and human sinfulness. And last week, when we looked at this, Paul threw something out that was slightly controversial, and it was a great deal of our conversation that we had. And that was this comprehension, this understanding that the law drove us to sin. And so now we're going to spend several verses here this week to kind of unpack that a little bit. But before we unpack it, we're going to deal with a perspective. For remember, Paul is writing to a community that he does not know. This is not a church in Rome that he planted. This is a church that he is writing a letter to in hopes of developing a relationship with them later when he launches off into a ministry towards Greece and the other side of the Mediterranean, all the way to Spain. And so what we're looking at here is we're looking at this relationship that's not based on an understanding of each other, but it's based on what Paul wants to share. It's based on what Paul feels is important for the church in Rome to know. Thus, he's got to make assumptions. And he's going to make an assumption today, and that assumption is going to be a complaint. The assumption is going to be a question that he believes his audience has based on what we were sharing last week, what he shared earlier here in chapter 7. And so we're going to start off with that in verse 7, and then we're going to move through an explanation of that, and at the end he's going to wrap it up. So basically, when we get right down to it, if you take a look at verses 7 and verse 12 and put them together, you'll get the main idea of what Paul's talking about. Everything in verses 8, 9, 10, and 11 are basically explaining what he's saying in verses 7 and verse 12. And so we're going to take a look at that and look at it from that perspective to say that there's a basic truth that he wants to share, but then there's a deeper, a more nuanced look at that truth that he's going to share in these verses. So let's go ahead and take a look down, and we'll read through verses 7 through 12 of chapter 7 of Romans, and we'll come back and we'll look at it verse by verse. So let's listen to the word of the Lord. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would have not known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. Thanks be to God for the reading of this word. So let's jump back in and let's take a look at verse 7 with that perspective, with that question that Paul is dealing with before anybody even asks it. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." So we understand that Paul is answering here a question before it's even asked. Now, granted, as the church in Rome was listening to this letter, as the church in Rome was reading this letter, they might have been asking the question, but as far as we know, we haven't heard the question asked. Paul's assuming, and I know we shouldn't do that, but Paul's assuming that he knows the question that's being asked because he's saying something very powerful, and that is the connection between law and sinfulness. And so he wants to make sure that he's very clear with this. So the question that is being asked in Paul's mind that he's answering is the question of, is the law sinful? And what do we know that Paul is saying in this verse? That the law isn't sinful. The law isn't sinful. So in essence, if you check out now and don't pick up again till verse 12, you'll understand what this passage is all about, that the law isn't sinful. Now, verses 8, 9, 10, and 11 are going to go into a very clear definition or a very clear explanation as to why Paul believes the law is not sinful. But it's important for us to understand that he's saying here at the very beginning, and he will wrap up these verses at the end by saying that the law isn't sinful. Well, to do this, he's going to need to make a point. He needs something that he can use as the basis for his conversation. So, of course, he's going to pick something from the law. And what he picks from the law is this concept of coveting. And coveting means deeply desiring something or someone. And so this is the law that he's going to pick up. Do not covet. That's a part of the law of what we would call the Old Testament. And so he's going to look at this. Not that you couldn't use any law to look at this, but he picks coveting specifically. And he's going to come back to it again and again and again over these next few verses as he's using this example as the foundation for his argument that the law isn't sinful. The law is holy and righteous and it's good, but we've got to be aware of what the law is good for and what it's not good for. We've got to be aware of our own problems when it comes to the law and how we could get tripped up by the law. But we understand that he's going to be taking a look at this concept of coveting. And he picks coveting for probably a multiple of reasons. One of the reasons I believe is that because of the fact that we all understand coveting. We all know what it's like to covet. We know what it's like to covet something that our neighbor has. We know what it's like to covet power or to covet wealth or something like that. And so it's something that we can easily relate to and we can connect with it. So he's going to use that as the foundation. Let's look at verse 8. Verse 8 goes on and says, But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. For apart from the law, sin was dead. So we take a look at this and we see that he's first and foremost saying that sin takes advantage of a command. Sin takes advantage of a command, meaning that if we are told not to do something, then by nature as human beings, we have a tendency to focus on that thing that we're not supposed to do, which brings it to the forefront. And so sin knows about this. Now, at the very basis, we have to understand that when we're talking about sin, we're not talking about actions. We're not talking about decisions. In essence, in these verses, we're looking at sin as like this living entity. As God said to Cain way back in Genesis, that sin is crouching at your door. It's waiting to devour you. You must overcome it. And it's this understanding of sin as a creature, in essence, when you put it that way, for us to see that sin is not just an action. Yes, sin is action, but sin's not just an action. That sin is something that is an entity. It's a creation. It is something that is moving around, a creature that's moving around, that is looking for ways to trip you and I up, looking for ways to separate us from God, because sin is something that separates us from God. And so what separates me from God might not be a problem for you, and vice versa. What separates you from God might not be a problem for me. And sin understands that, and sin realizes that. Sin will find each one of our individual weaknesses and then just drip and drip and drip into it, and just try to break that open. And so when we take a look at this passage, when we're dealing with sin, especially in its relationship to the law, we must understand that sin is not just an action, it's not just a decision. It's this entity, it's this thing, it's this creature that wants to devour us. It's this creature that wants to separate us from God. It's a part of our reality. It's a part of the world. You can deny it, but it doesn't change the fact that it's a part of this world. And so sin takes advantage of a command. When we receive a command not to do something, then sin takes advantage of that and whispers in our ear, why not? Don't you deserve to do that? Shouldn't you be free to do that? And that's how sin works. Sin works in our very own lives through pushing on our own willfulness, pushing in on our own rebellion, pushing in on our own created in the image of God, because we have just enough God in us to be dangerous, to understand that there's something bigger than ourselves. And sin will use that against us. And many times sin will use it against us by saying, you deserve this, or you should be able to do this. And so sin takes advantage of a command. If we don't have a command to not do something, then there's nothing that sin can rage against. There's nothing that sin can come and say something to you about. So the law, in essence, opens up the door for sin to take advantage of that command. Well, when we look at this, we see two ideas basically at work. The very first idea that we see at work is the basic understanding that humans are naturally rebellious. You do not have to teach a human being how to be rebellious. You do not have to teach a baby how to say no. You do not have to teach a child how to cry when they want something. There's this understanding of rebellion. There's this understanding of our nature as human beings. And that's something that's there. So regardless of the presence of the law or not the presence of the law, human beings are still rebellious. So when we look back into that period of time between Abraham and Moses, when the law did not exist, there still was sin. There still was rebellion because as human beings, we were present. So there was still that rebellion in us. There was still that sin that was happening, even though it wasn't labeled. And that's going to be a very important distinction for us to understand as we look further in this passage. That it wasn't labeled, but it didn't mean that it wasn't existing. It still existed. It was still there. The second thing that we look at is that we understand that sin exists with or without the law. And that's the piece that we were just talking about. Sin exists with or without the law. Sin is a part of creation. Sin is a part of this world. Sin is a part of our reality. Every single person struggles with sin. Every single person deals with sin. Hopefully, we have the ability to overcome the sin in our life through our faith in Jesus, but many times, even with the faith in Jesus, we fall short of the mark. And we aren't able to overcome all of our sin. And again, as we go through this process, it's not about beating ourselves up. It's not about saying we're bad people, but it's about acknowledging that and getting real with that. That sin exists with or without the law. So again, as Paul started, he said the law is not sinful. Sin existed above and beyond the law. Sin existed before there was a law. Sin will exist after the law. So sin is not, the law is not sinful, I mean. And so sin is an entity that is separate from that. It's something that we deal with in our reality, and the law happens to address it. The law happens to deal with it. But the law is not sinful in itself, even though we're going to see as we go through this process that the law has a tendency to push us towards sin, has a tendency to open up our perspective to sin, has a tendency to get us to dwell on sin. And we're going to understand the bigger ramifications of that as we look forward. So verse 9 goes on and says, "Once I was alive, apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died." Let's listen to that again. Once I was alive. Now remember, this is Paul speaking. So Paul is referring to himself here in verse 9. Once I, Paul, was alive. Once I was alive apart from the law. But when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. So we've got to unpack that a little bit. First, when we take a look at is this concept of the law. The law equals awareness of spiritual disconnection. The law does not create spiritual disconnection. The law just brings an awareness of spiritual disconnection. The law does not create sin. The law just brings an awareness to sin. And that is the purpose of the law. Has always been the purpose of the law and will always be the purpose of the law. The law cannot save us. The law is not our Messiah. The law is not our Lord and Savior. The law simply had the task, the goal of making us aware of our spiritual disconnection, making us aware of the sin in our life so that we would make the choice to do something about it. And this is something that Paul has stated over and over and over again in this letter. This is a point that if you've been following this study of Romans, it's hopefully been driven home to you by now, that you realize that the purpose of the law was not salvation. The law cannot save. The purpose of the law was to bring us to a realization and an understanding of the spiritual disconnection that we have. Basically the understanding that we can't be good enough. And so the law had a specific purpose. And just because the law had that purpose does not make the law bad. Just because the law reveals the sin does not make the law sinful. And to use an example to talk about this, we're going to talk about the doctor's visit. And so we're going to pretend for a moment about a scenario. Say you just recently got health insurance and you finally have full coverage and you're able to go and get a physical where you didn't have to pay those massive copays and all the lab tests and everything like that. It was covered by your insurance. So you make your appointment with a doctor and you show up and the doctor does the exam and then you get the blood work and you come back and you meet with the doctor to review everything that the doctor discovered through this annual physical. Well, at that annual physical, when you come in and sit down, the doctor reveals to you that you are dying, that your body is riddled with cancer and probably just gives you about a month to live. And you get up and you leave the doctor's office and now you understand or now you know that you have a month to live. The thing that's interesting is that when you came into the doctor's office, you were feeling great. When you came in for your physical, you didn't think you had any problems whatsoever. Now, you're leaving the doctor's office and you have got a death sentence. It's going to change your perspective, isn't it? When you leave that doctor's office, you're going to feel every single ache and pain in your body, and you're going to believe that it has something to do with your imminent termination of life. You believe it's going to be the end of everything. It's just another example of it. Well, what was the difference between you when you came in feeling great and you when you left feeling every sensation, every pain in your body, which leads you to understand that you're dying? Information, exactly. You now know. The doctor told you. Did the doctor cause you to have cancer? No. Is the doctor killing you? No. All the doctor's doing is revealing to you that which was already there. You just were unaware of it. This is a good example of the power of the law. This is a good example of the ministry of the law, the importance of the law. It's important for the doctor to be able to tell you that you have cancer and that your life is ending. But it's also, too, important for us to understand that the law's purpose of bringing us to that place where we realize that we're spiritually disconnected, we realize that we're dying, it's important, too. The law doesn't cause the sin. The law isn't sinful. It just merely shines a light on it. It reveals the sin to us. Listen to the words again. Once I was alive apart from the law. Once I walked into the doctor's office and I was none the wiser. I thought life was great. I felt great. I thought I was in great shape. But when the commandment came, when the doctor showed up with all of the tests and all of the results, sin sprang to life and I died. And then when the doctor came with all the results and said I had cancer, then boom, death comes into my life. It's a part of my reality now, where before it wasn't a part of my reality. Not that it wasn't part of my reality, I just didn't realize it was a part of my reality. And that's the purpose of the law. And this, again, is what Paul has been driving home to us for several chapters now, is for us to understand the purpose of the law. The law was never intended to save. The law was always intended to show us our shortcomings, to show us how sinful we are, to show us that we can't be good enough on our own. And this doctor's visit example is what we're looking at here. And it connects with what Paul is saying, because remember in verse 9 is saying, once I was alive. So Paul is using himself. You can make an argument about Paul talking about a theoretical subject. This is Paul talking about himself. This is the realization that he came to. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. When I left the doctor's office after that diagnosis, death entered my reality. Now, I wasn't dead. I was still physically walking around, but now death was a blip on my radar screen. Now death was a part of my reality, where before it wasn't. And the only difference is knowledge. The only difference is coming to realize it, and that's the purpose of the law. So let's look at verse 10 as we go forward. Verse 10 goes on, I, meaning Paul again, I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. So when we take a look at the commandment, as he says here, I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life was the commandment that he was talking about earlier, the commandment of do not covet. That was the law that we were taking a look at. So we're going to go back to that example. So using that as the example, I found that do not covet was intended to bring life. The purpose of do not covet was to prevent us from coveting, because coveting can lead us down a slippery slope into very bad behaviors. They can be very bad decisions. When we covet something, we can make decisions to do anything in order to get that which we covet, even break the law or hurt other people or disregard other people. So do not covet is what we're going to be focusing on in this verse. And do not covet makes us want to covet. Yes. Do not covet makes us want to covet. This is just a natural outcropping of our creation as human beings. When you tell someone not to do something, there is something inside them that switches and they say, wonder why? Or switches and says, why not? Or switches and says, I'd like to try that. You know, there's something in us. Again, we can go all the way back to created in the image of God, that we have just enough image of God in us to make us dangerous, that we know that there's something bigger out there. We know that there's something greater out there, that we understand that there's more to life than what we're experiencing. And maybe this thing that I'm coveting is the thing that I'm missing. And so the command, do not covet, makes us want to covet. Now, was God up in heaven when the law came down, do not covet, and now God's going, oh my gosh, if I would have just known that would have made me covet more, I wouldn't have done it? Of course not. That's not the way it works. In order for us to truly experience life, we must have all the options laid out on the table. In order for us to truly experience life, we have got to know that coveting is a part of our reality. And we've got to understand that once we know that coveting is a part of our reality, just like when we have a death sentence from the doctor, our minds will turn towards it. Our minds will focus on it. And that's just a part of the reality. That's the part of the truth of being you and me. And we would much rather live in the truth of being you and me than living with blinders on or going down the river of denial. God has given us everything that we need, even more than we need, in order for us to function in life, in order for us to make good decisions, in order for us to be the people that He's created us to be. But if He keeps anything from us, then we can't be all that we were created to be, because reality wouldn't be real. And that's what we're looking at in this verse. In verse 10, we're looking at, I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life, the very commandment of do not covet, was intended to bring life, actually brought death. It actually made me covet more. It made me struggle with coveting more. It made me realize the coveting that I had in my life even more. And that's something that separates me from the love of God. So in verse 10, we also see that the law proved that Paul was spiritually dead. That Paul was spiritually dead. Not that you were spiritually dead or I'm spiritually dead, which we are, but in this specific example, that Paul was spiritually dead. Again, he uses himself as the example. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. And so this is Paul acknowledging that he's spiritually dead. And if Paul is acknowledging that he's spiritually dead, then we have to understand that we are spiritually dead. Because what Paul experienced and the understanding that Paul had and the gifts that Paul was given, the ministry that he had, opened up the door for him to do things that you and I can only fathom. But yet, even in all of that, he still came to understand he was spiritually dead. And so you and I understand that we're spiritually dead. And in essence, what he's saying is that every single human being is spiritually dead, that we cannot be good enough on our own. We can't be smart enough on our own. We can't be right enough on our own. And so we see that in this confession that he's making here, again, using himself. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. So when I received the commandment, do not covet, it made me covet more. It made me realize how much I was coveting. Maybe that's a better way to say it. It made me realize how much I was actually coveting. And then that frustrated me because I couldn't overcome my coveting. And that's the purpose of the law, for us to get to that place where we get so frustrated that we know we can't do it on our own. We throw up our hands and we give up. And that's the purpose of the law. And again, he's driving that point home, just using a little different argument for it. So let's take a look at verse 11. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So again, Paul's referring to himself. He's not making reference to you or me. He's making reference to himself. He's not talking about them or those people. He's talking about himself. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, again, the commandment we're talking about is do not covet specifically, the seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So we have to understand that awareness of our covetousness drives us to covet. So an aware of covetousness and driven to covet. That is our reality. That's the reality when it comes specifically to coveting. You can take anything that you want. Awareness of our lies drives us to lie. Awareness of whatever drives us to do whatever. This is this understanding of our human condition. When we ever bring something into our reality, when we bring something into our life, we can't unsee it. We can't unthink it. We can't wipe it away. It's always there. So once it's revealed, then it's a part of us. Once it's revealed, it's a part of our daily experience. Once it's revealed, it's a part of who we are. And instead of raging against that machine and saying, well, that's just wrong, I'm not going to do that, and denying it, we need to get real and acknowledge it and understand that the purpose of the law was to bring me to that place where I could acknowledge and understand and get real and say, I struggle with this. I struggle with this. When we take a look at the concept of being of coveting, we understand that being aware of covetousness drives us to covet. And so it's a double-edged sword, and it has to be that way. It's the only way that we can live in truth. It's the only way that we can live in a right relationship with God, because until we get real with God, God will never be real to us. But that requires us to embrace the things that we are now labeled through the law. The things that maybe we didn't have a name for before, we have a name for now. Not that we do it more, but we realize it more. Not that we do it more often, but now we just realize it more often. It becomes a part of our awareness. Again, as I said, once we see it, we can't unsee it. because it's a part of who we are now. Again, also, too, we look at this concept of sin's deception. Listen to the words of Paul again. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me. It deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So what's the deception of sin? Again, remember, sin's not an action. Sin is this living entity for this conversation. This sin is crouching at your door waiting to devour you, as God said to Cain in Genesis. It's this understanding of sin will deceive us. And how does sin deceive us? Sin's deception is acting on our own desire is best. That's what sin's always going to say, regardless of what the sin is, regardless of what the action is, regardless of what the decision is. Sin's always going to make the argument in our life of saying, you deserve this. If it feels good, do it. It's all about you. It puts you at the center of the universe. It puts you at the center of the world. Remember, sin is anything that separates you from God. Well, how can sin separate you from God? The best way for sin to separate you and I from God is to make sure that you and I believe we're God. Put ourselves in God's place. And this is sin's deception. So regardless of what the action is, regardless of what the temptation is, it all boils down to this. When you go back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, this was the temptation for Adam and Eve to be God, for them to have the knowledge of good and evil just like God does. That's the thing that sin uses. Now, what that thing is, maybe it's coveting or lying or stealing or whatever the case may be. It might be different for different people, but the foundational piece is the same, that sin will always use this deception. You deserve it. You always use this deception. Act on your own desires, because that's best. Always, when push comes to shove and you have to make a decision, always act on your best interest. Always act on your own desires. Don't think about anybody else. Don't think about God. Don't think about the world. Don't think about compassion. Don't think about grace. Just think about you and what you want and what you deserve and what you should have. And that's sin's great deception. And that's a part of what he's talking about. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, do not covet, deceived me. How did it deceive me? Because it deceived me by saying, go after your own desires. It's okay to covet that because you deserve it. You've worked hard to get that. So it deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. And in the deception, falling to it, I find that I break the commandment and brings death into my life. Not that it wasn't there before. Again, we go back to that understanding of the doctor's visit. It's the realization of the truth. It's the realization of its presence. So let's look at verse 12 to sum it all up. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. So again, we have this way of Paul speaking and writing here to teach a lesson. And if you go back to verse 7 and combine it with verse 12, you get the overall big picture understanding of these verses. So let's read verses 7 and verse 12 together. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. The commandment is holy, the law is holy, righteous, and good because it does exactly what it was designed to do. Again, remember, our righteousness, our holiness, our perfection that God is seeking is not for us to be holy and righteous and perfect. It's for us to be complete. It's for us to be who we have been created to be. And the law is exactly who the law has been created to be. God created the law in order to show us our imperfections. God created the law in order to shine a light on our shortcomings. God created the law so that we would throw up our hands and surrender and say, I can't do this on my own. I can't be good enough on my own. And in the living out of that purpose, the law is good. It's holy. It's righteous. It is not sinful. Just like for you and for me. Our goal is not to be perfect, to be righteous, to be sinless, because that's an impossibility. Our goal is to be complete. Our goal is to be the complete creation of God in this moment, at this time, whoever we are, wherever we are, and however God has created us. That's who we're called to be. That's what makes us holy. That's what makes us righteous. to be all that God has created us to be. And the way that we live into that is not to follow a law. The way that we live into that is not to keep all the do's and don'ts. The way that we live into that is a relationship with God the Father through Jesus Christ the Son. And that relationship is the thing that brings us to our completion. That relationship is the thing that brings us to that holiness and that righteousness that we are in Jesus. And the law can never do that. Will never do that. And it's really our fault for ever putting the law in that place, because we put it on a pedestal that it can never reach. We put it in a place that it can never fulfill that goal. And so Paul is teaching us over and over again that this law is to show and to reveal in us our imperfections, to reveal in us the sinfulness, so that we, through our faith in Jesus, can deal with it. So we, through our faith in Jesus, can come alongside and get real and say, I struggle with this, help me. And so we understand that the law allows us to really see ourselves. This is the greatest gift that the law could ever give us, is that ability to really see ourselves. Because until we get real with God, God will never be real with us. And we can't get real with God until we're real to ourselves. Until we take off all of our masks and we surrender all of our secrets and we become that whom God has created us to be in this moment, in this place, at this time. And so that's the purpose of the law. And that's what makes the law, as it says here, holy and righteous and good. Because it is what God has created it to be. Just like you and I can be holy and righteous and good simply by being who we have been created to be. So it ends up with what he talked about at the beginning, and that is that the law is good. The law is good. Again, you combine verses 7 and verse 12 together and you get the idea of what he's trying to teach. Everything in between verses 7 and verse 12 is kind of the argument for it. It's kind of the way that he defends his position. And so that's why it's so important. So if you get nothing else, get that the law is good for what it was created to be. It was created to be something that revealed or shined a light on our sins so that we could surrender to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And in that light, the law is good. Now, does it push us towards sin? Of course. That's a reality of our creation. Whenever something is brought to our attention, whenever something is brought to our perspective, we can't unsee it. So yes, the law will reveal in us our sinfulness. It won't make us more sinful. It will reveal in us our sinfulness, which will appear to make us more sinful. But the law is not sinful. It merely shines a light. And that's where we're going to leave off today. I pray that there has been a blessing in this, and next week, look forward to you joining us when Taylor's feeling better and he's back with us, and we'll be live streaming the live Bible study, so you'll be able to get the conversations between everybody. But until now and then, I pray that you stay safe, I pray that you stay sane, and have a great week.